we give a great welcome to our host today, which is Benjamin Smith, that I thank you for being here. And I make a short presentation of the background of Benjamin, and then I will give him the space for his presentation, making him host also, which is already. Benjamin studied archaeology at the University of Cambridge under Professor Philipson, and then for his PhD, Ian Hodder. And he's studied for the PhD mainly, if I understand correctly, was on pygmy rock art in Central Africa. And also a note for the Centro Camuno. In that period, he also had the opportunity to meet Professor Anati, who was, as Benjamin said, the only person who studied the Malawi rock art before in the past. So that's also an interesting note. He went to Val Camonica to meet Professor Anati, and so he encountered our beloved Valcamonican rock art. From 2000 to 2012, he's been the director of the Rock Art Research Institute of the Wits University in Johannesburg, and also, of course, it's not the same thing. I had the opportunity to meet Benjamin Smith, and it was a very very nice time that I spent there. So I still thank him for the welcome that the Institute gave me. Since 2013, he's professor of archaeology with a specialization of world rock art at the University of Western Australia. So welcome, Benjamin, and you can start your presentation.
Thank you very much, Matteo, and it's a great pleasure to be able to give this presentation to, well, a world audience, but speaking through Val Camonica, which is a place that was important in my upbringing as a rock art researcher, a place that inspired me to spend my life and devote my life to rock art research. It's still a very, very inspiring center for the world study of rock art. What I'm going to talk about today is a controversial subject. Controversy is always good, particularly when it's late at night, like it is here in Australia. It's 9 o'clock at night here. I'm going to talk about protecting the world's largest rock art site from destruction by industry. I will begin by acknowledging country. In Australia, we have a tradition that we acknowledge the land that we speak on and the land that we speak about. I will acknowledge that I am sitting on Noongar Whadjuk land. This land was never ceded. This land was never sold. The Whadjuk remain the spiritual, cultural custodians of this land. This land always was and always will be Whadjuk land. But I will be talking about rock art under a different custodianship. I'll be talking about rock art that is under the cultural custodianship of the Ngalama, Yindjibarndi, Yabarara, Motadunera, and the Wangatu peoples. This is up in the northern part of Western Australia. I thank the traditional owners for supporting this research, and I pay respects to their leaders past, present, and emerging. The land that I'm talking about is a very special country. The image that you're seeing now is of Murujuga. You can see there, hundreds of thousands of rocks piled in a landscape. It looks like an industrial wasteland. It's not. That's a natural hillside covered in these gabbro and granophyre, so two different rock types, boulders. And what makes this place special is that almost every one of those boulders is engraved with rock art. This is a truly special landscape. It's beautiful. There's nowhere else quite like it in the world. It's also a very controversial place here in Australia. And just this week, there have been a couple of news articles. There's news articles almost every week about Murujuga. This week, it was a claim that it's from the looking at a probe into how much the rock art is being damaged by industrial emissions. And the lead of that project said it's obviously a challenge when we have media and other anecdotal papers coming out trying to say the answer is already there when it's clear that it's not. Quite a controversial statement, but this is a statement that we've heard 20, 30, 40 times over the past 40 years. And that's really what I want to talk about this evening. I want to talk about the evidence. What evidence do we have about the effects of industrial emissions on the rock art of Murujuga, however politically fraught it might be to talk about such a topic? You know, there are billions of dollars of petrochemical money vested in this place. And so there are big vested interests here, as well as obviously cultural interests as one of the most important rock art places. I want to tell a bigger story today to try and give a bit of a sense of the history of that place. So I'm going to, for those who, the international audience, I'm going to take a journey back and look at the development of that landscape as an industrial place. And I will then come forward to the science and start talking about, well, what is it that we really know about what industrial pollution is doing to that rock art? What are the implications of our knowledge? I'll just start by introducing the place itself. For those that don't know it, I mean, many of the Australian viewers who are watching this now will know the place well, but many of you overseas won't. You'll see in that one picture that I showed you, stunningly beautiful place. It's basically a collection of islands and a peninsula that used to be an island, known as the Burrup Peninsula or Murujuga to the locals, which means hip bone standing up. It kind of looks like a hip bone sticking out into the sea. And it's surrounded by a bunch of islands, and there's rock art all over both that peninsula and the islands. And it sits right at the top of Western Australia, facing out into the Indian Ocean. You can see there, quite a long way from the state capital, Perth. So it's about a 16-hour car journey from Perth, a long way north. And the industry there has kind of operated out of sight, out of mind for many years. I think that's what they would like to think anyway. It's a landscape, as I say, that is full of rock art. There are, conservatively, 1 million rock engravings in this landscape. Recently, a number of scholars have said that that is a gross underestimation, that the work now suggests that there could be as many as 2 million rock engravings in that landscape. So it's a relatively small landscape, as you saw. It's probably the size of the area with rock art in Valcamonica, for example, if you take all the different areas taken together. So 1 million rock engravings is really, really something. In a relatively small area. This is the most concentrated area of rock art in the world. It's also got a number of other features that are important about it. Not least is the incredible sequence. So at Murujuga, researchers such as Joe McDonald and Ken Mulvaney, who's shown in the picture here, have charted changes in the art sequence, just as we have changes in the art of Valcamonica, that you can push back through time, and you can then place broad age ranges based on the things that you're seeing in the rock art. And what we realize is that there's an art sequence at Murujuga pretty much unbroken, a continuing art sequence that goes back at least 40,000 years, probably 50,000. Most people today would think it's probably closer to 50,000. And you can see in those tracings there some quite big changes. So this was a landscape that used to be inland. When the sea level rose, it only reached that area some 7,000 years ago. And so what you see in the rock art is a radical change from an art that is entirely dominated by land mammals to the more recent times, an art predominantly dominated by maritime species. And so we're able to tie that, of course, to known geological changes in the climate changes in the area, and also to a number of animal extinctions. So things like the Thylacine, so the fat-tailed macropod. There's a number of extinct animals shown in the rock art that have helped researchers to be able to create this relative chronology, but a fairly accurate relative chronology tied to climatic changes and changes in the sea level that obviously affect content of the art. So a place where we're able to see a broad sweep, a broad history of ancient art extending back 47,000 years. Now that's a pretty special place. There are not many sites in the world where you can see this concentration of rock art going back that far. What some of the special things, some of the earliest depictions of the human face, there are human faces depicted right in those very first images. So 40-something thousand years ago. There are very few other places in the world. You don't get human faces in Europe at that stage. There's no art back 47,000 years, certainly no human faces. So it's possible we're looking there at the very first images that survive of the human face, a truly important place. Over the last 10 more years, Ken Mulvaney and Joe McDonald have run a whole series of training schools for students, recording large areas of that landscape, particularly the areas that are threatened with industrial development, recording thousands and thousands and thousands of images. I think they're up to 12,000 now, probably even more. And that is just a tiny blip in what actually exists of an art that is, you know, a million or 2 million images in that landscape. As well as just the number, the age, the significance of the art also is very important in the living heritage of the peoples of that area, in the traditions, beliefs. This is a law place, so a place where people were taught the sacred knowledge from their ancestors. It's a Thalu site, so it's an animal increase site. It's a dreaming place. There's a dreaming place at Murujuga. This is a really important place for sacred knowledge and secret knowledge. And the rock art itself is said to be very powerful and very important. And for that reason, the traditional owners don't allow a whole range of images to be shown. They think they're just too powerful, they're too dangerous. They shouldn't be shown in PowerPoint presentations such as this. So I'm only showing you images for which permissions have been granted and that have been declared culturally safe for public exhibition. All of those early human face images, for example, are not to be shown. They're simply too powerful. So this is an important place archaeologically, but a very, very important place culturally in terms of Indigenous Aboriginal Australians and traditional, what we would call in Australia, traditional owners, the people whose land this is and the people who speak for the land. So an amazing place. And I'm not going to show you hundreds of pictures. I just want you to enjoy the beauty of this place and the sort of the strange rocky landscape that is Murujuga. You can see there a large bird on that rock on the left, and that animal on the image on the right is probably the extinct thylacine, the so-called Tasmanian tiger. This large carnivorous marsupial, kind of the last one was at Berlin Museum and died there, but depicted in the rock art of Murujuga. Probably went extinct some sort of 3,000 odd years ago, but that image is much older than that. That image would be put back probably older than 20,000 years. So looking at this landscape, it all looks pristine, it all looks beautiful. I've chosen images here that are carefully chosen from the right direction. If I were to swivel my camera here, you'd be looking at a very different landscape, a near industrial apocalypse landscape. And that's really what I want to talk about now. Sorry, my laptop's gone. The great mistake happened in 1961 when the Commonwealth Government of Australia was looking to start exports of iron ore from Western Australia. Up until this time, there had been a ban on the import of iron ore post-war. All the iron ore was needed and was used in Australia and in the Commonwealth. After 1961, Australia stopped that ban, and in particular, a range of contracts were signed with Japan to export iron ore to Japan. Now, there's no iron ore at Murujuga, but much further inland there is, and they were looking for a suitable place for a port facility where they could bring a train to the coast and export iron ore. The first place they looked at was a few hundred kilometers along the coast from Murujuga, called Dupuque Island. And when the archaeologists from the museum went to Dupuque Island to look at it and see if it was suitable for development as an iron export port, they discovered it was rich in rock art and said it was far too precious to be damaged. And they therefore recommended that Murujuga was chosen instead, or the Burrup Peninsula. Unfortunately then, very few people had been to Murujuga. There was very little known about it. And the statement at that time in 1964, when the report was written, was that Murujuga was poorer in quality and quantity and comprised about 200 engravings. In fact, it's much richer, both in quality and quantity, and comprises about 2 million engravings. But unfortunately, the decision was made on the basis of that incomplete knowledge. Murujuga was chosen as the place for the export port facility, and kind of that's history. Ever since then, we've been living with the impact of that decision. So in 1963, a massive iron shipping facility was built at Murujuga. The actual construction of that facility didn't do a lot of damage to the rock art. The train track was bashed through and went out, and then ships would come in from Japan mainly at that stage to collect the iron and head off. It was the start of pollution. Obviously, those ships emit a lot of sulfur dioxide. They burn diesel, and that emits pollution. And there was quite a bit of iron dust, but iron dust is not something that would in any way damage the rock art. Those rocks are quite iron rich. The surface is already quite iron rich. It would have no impact. But it wasn't just the export facility. You can see in that picture there on the right, there's the railway going through. You can see the jetty there at the end. But of course, when you have a big export facility like that and a railway, you need labor, you need a workers' compound. And so a mining town was built, owned by the mining company. And that was called Dampier, after one of the first people to come up to this part. And that was built a couple of years later in 1966. You can see there an area of land has kind of been flattened and all these houses built. So start to the damage of the land, and there certainly were rock art sites where Dampier was built, but it was kept away from the rock art areas. With a functioning port, it became possible, of course, then to export other things. And the next development was a massive salt production facility that went online in 1968. That needed its own port facilities, and you can see there a chain of islands now linked by causeways on the top right, and ships coming in to collect that salt. Salt, of course, is quite caustic, and salt dust blowing across the rocks can have quite a profound damage. And I'll show an image later of some of the damage that salt production has done to the rock art. All of this happened without any form of Aboriginal consent or even consultation. This is before any Heritage Act here in Western Australia. And so this simply proceeded on the basis of government approvals. This started to change in the 1970s when Dampier, when the salt company employed Enzo Virilli, the man at the bottom left there. And he took a great interest in the rock engravings, started to record them, to map them, and published a few popular articles saying how important the area was and that it needed to be protected. There was also an official site inspection. People came out to look at the area and to see what was there. People by this stage were already starting to talk about the fact that this was an area perhaps where development would have to proceed cautiously because of its cultural significance and the incredible amount of rock art that was there. Some of the early people that were there who are quite internationally famous, Robert Bednarik. In fact, this was the first place that he was stationed when he came out to Australia. He wasn't an archaeologist. Bednarik was an engineer. And he came out to work in this area for his engineering skills, but started to take an interest in the rock art of Murujuga and spent his weekends and holidays sort of walking all over the peninsula recording rock art. And he was the first one really to record many of those sites. He made friends with the only archaeologist, with the leading archaeologist working in the state at the time, Sylvia Hallam, who's in the picture there on the left. And she also went up and raised awareness of the significance of the area and the importance of protecting the rock art. The first heritage legislation in Western Australia was passed in 1972, the Aboriginal Heritage Act, and that made it compulsory to consult with Aboriginal people after this time and started to place conditions on the development of cultural sites. But before this, there'd been no requirement at all for consultation with Aboriginal people. It's hard to imagine now that such an important cultural site could be developed in the 1960s. There's almost nowhere else in the world where it could have happened. And Australia had a particularly unique setup at that time. All of the interest, the academic interest that was starting to be paid to the area didn't stop further development. Large amounts of offshore gas were found far out to sea, and a place was needed where that gas could be brought on land. And the place that was chosen, unfortunately, was Murujuga. It could have come on land anywhere, but because the port was there, this seemed to be, or was deemed at the time to be the appropriate place. And the area where that went was immediately to the north of Dampier, an area that was actually extremely rich in archaeological and other heritage sites. And in 1982, you can see the extent of damage there to that landscape as they build what has become known as the Karratha gas plant. Maps were made at that time that are kept somewhat secret today, that show all of the sites that were destroyed. So the museum was asked, the West Australian Museum, teams from the West Australian Museum were told very last minute that they needed to go up and record everything before it was destroyed and to salvage whatever they could. And their maps and their work is absolutely crucial in our understanding now of exactly what was done and how much damage was done. Over 1,700 rock engravings were moved in total, but people like Robert Bednarik have estimated that another 10,000 or so were actually destroyed in the process of preparing that landscape for industry. You can see a picture there of someone smashing with a mallet, smashing a rock art in the rock to move it off to safety, but obviously doing untold damage in the meantime. All of those museum workers who worked, up there at Dampier were highly critical of what was going on and simply the amount of damage that was being wreaked on an incredibly important archaeological landscape without any proper mitigation. To give you a sense of what happened, here's a picture in 1980, sort of pre-development, post-development. And from my photographs, you can probably know that, all of those areas at the top that are in red, those kind of rusty red areas are going to be rich. Those were all rich in rock art. Also beautiful beaches there. This was a site that, not just rich in rock art, but all sorts of archaeology. This is a place that would have been intensely occupied over the last 50,000 years. Incredibly rich cultural landscape. And you can see here how it was cleared to make way for the gas plant. Once the gas plant was there, obviously you've got the pipeline coming on shore. Further developments were almost an inevitability. And in 2001, a major request for expansion was put into the government, which the government eagerly approved because of the amount of money that it would bring into the state. So a massive expansion. People by this stage were becoming very aware of the significance of Murujuga, and there were quite large public protests at that time. And you can see one here. People started to question the wisdom of ongoing development of Murujuga, particularly given that, you know, it's not there are no minerals at Murujuga. There's no reason why any of this industry has to be there. It's not a mining site. It's not like most other places in Australia where you kind of have to put the mine where the minerals are. This is not one of those places. We just have the misfortune that there's a port here. But that port could have gone in one of 100 places along the West Australian coast. It didn't need to be here. Most of this industry, there were ample choices. The industry could have gone somewhere else. One of the people who had led the museum work at Murujuga was a very great rock art researcher known as Patricia Vinnicum. And those in the audience from Southern Africa will know her well. Those in Australia probably know her well as well. She spent her whole career studying rock art in various parts of the world. And the last 20 years of her life were spent up at Murujuga fighting, well, first working with the museum to mitigate the damage being done there, but also working very closely with the traditional owners of the time and trying to allow their voice and trying to ensure that their voice was heard and that the protests against the continued industrialization of the Burrup were brought to a wide audience. She worked closely with Robert Bednarik to try and spread the word around the world about what was happening at Murujuga and that what was happening there was not right. And one of the last papers that she wrote was in 2002, which is an absolutely stinging critique of the development work at Murujuga. She died in 2003, fittingly on the Burrup. So she was actually in Murujuga fighting against a new development when she had a heart attack. So in a sense, she died fighting for the conservation of Murujuga. At the same time, those protests were starting to have effect, but there was also the need to deal with the requirements then for approvals for the expansion of the gas plant. And so a deal was done and an agreement was signed called the Burrup Maitland Industrial Estates Agreement, which was signed in 2002. And under that, the Aboriginal groups, the 5 groups I mentioned at the beginning, signed off their rights to the industrial lands, and in return, they received a large section of Murujuga that had not been developed in native title. So kind of a deal was done where 52 or 53% roughly of Murujuga was returned to native title for perpetual preservation by the communities, but the other part was then ceded for industrial development. And under that agreement, the traditional owners, the Aboriginal groups, ceased to be allowed to have any say in any industrial development on that land that had been deemed for industrial development. So many people today are calling this a gag clause, that they are not allowed now, because of this agreement, to speak out against further industrial development of those lands. And it's become a very controversial agreement. This was a very early agreement, and the traditional owners at the time felt that that this was an agreement that they needed to sign in order to stop development of the other parts of Murujuga. But the cost was high, that they ceded any rights over a say in the development of other areas. And so when that agreement was signed, was obviously then the green light for the development to take place, and the bulldozers moved in once again. Vast areas cleared, a large road cut through, and the person in the picture there is Robin Chappell, who is a renowned local politician here in Western Australia. He's a member of the Greens Party, and over more decades than one cares to remember, he has fought against the development of this landscape and recorded, these images are his, recording the destruction that was occurring to make sure that people would always remember what had happened, and it couldn't be denied. Thanks to his work and Robert Bednaric's work and Patricia Vinicum's work, the area was put on the World Monument Fund watch list of the 100 most endangered sites in the world, and it remained there for 6 years, from 2004 to 2010. And each year it was reported on, and as you can see there, sort of in 2006, between a rock and a hard place, the fate of Australia's Dampier rock art site hangs in the balance. And there was a real sense around the world that this place was being sacrificed to industry. The government was under pressure to show that it was serious about looking after the place, and so it set up its own monitoring program. It put it out to tender. The money came from industry, but very small amount. I think it was only $50,000 a year. It kind of nothing to do a major monitoring program, given the costs of getting to a remote area and working in a remote place. It started off by doing things like air quality control monitoring, and a major part of it as well was looking at color change in the rock art, because if the rock art starts to degrade due to industrial pollution, this rock is likely to fade in color. So they were looking at the effects over time and whether we could see evidence of the rock art fading. This monitoring became itself very controversial. Year after year, they publicly reported that they found no changes, and that there was no evidence whatsoever that industry was damaging the rock art. Independent researchers, a colleague of mine, Professor John Black, Simon Diffie, and Alona Box, all looked at the data, and they believed that first, that there were fundamental flaws with some of the data that was being collected. The color machine, for example, was changed in the middle of the experiments, and this affected the veracity of the ability to be able to compare year on year the measurements. Also, some you can see here that at certain times they're doing the measurements in full sun, other times under an umbrella, and even things like just moving where you have your probe on that rock surface. John Black was able to show that if you move it just a few millimeters, you get a fundamentally different reading. And are they sure that they get that probe in exactly the same place every year for 10 consecutive years? Well, no, they weren't. So there were major problems in the data being collected. But even so, Black, Diffie, and Box were able to show that there had been, contrary to the claims of the Commonwealth Scientific Industrial Research Organisation that was given the contract, that there had been a regular change, even in the flawed data that were collected, that you could see quite strong and consistent evidence of lightening of many of the rock surfaces. So that controversial program finished in 2016. And with many questions left unanswered, and many people feeling that that project had basically just spun out for over a decade any clear scientific decision on whether industrial pollution was damaging the rock art. It was almost as if it was set up to fail. With no scientific evidence at that stage that the rock art was being damaged by industrial pollution, yet further industrial developments were allowed to proceed. So one of the new industries that was set up is this one here, a liquid ammonium plant, so a fertilizer plant, adding yet more visual scarring to the landscape, adding yet more polluting technologies to the landscape. Again, many people stood up against it. It's not as if this was just allowed. Every time one of these decisions were made, they were protested by ordinary people, and they were challenged by academics as well. Robert Bednarik published his landmark book on Murujuga in 2006 called Australian Apocalypse, the story of Australia's greatest cultural monument, in which he laid out in great detail the history that I'm telling today, but also showed why he believed at that time that there was inescapable proof that the rock art was being damaged by industry, contrary to the claims of the government program at the time. As an acknowledgement of the importance of the place, the Commonwealth government, so that's the central government of Australia, registered Murujuga as a national heritage site, giving it a certain level of protection in 2007. Even with that status, so national heritage site status obviously only accrued to the non-industrial lands, and major expansion again moved forward in 2008, whereas Woodside continued with the Karratha gas plant, but now attaching beside that a new facility that liquefied the natural gas, making it more easy to export the gas in liquid form. And you can see there just the size of the hillside that was cleared to make way for that expansion. So today, this large Woodside owned and run operation that you're seeing there in its entirety, we're looking at one end, and those things that you can see at the other end are the other, at the other end of it, you can just see in the far distance there, this massive industrial plant, one of the largest industrial plants in the Southern Hemisphere, built on top of many rock art and heritage sites, and bringing, processing the gas that's coming on shore in the pipeline from far out to sea. And in this case, at least part of the structure you're seeing there, liquefying it to make liquefied natural gas. In 2013, the Murujuga created their, they turned that National Heritage Site into a formally registered national park. And you can see there for the first time that I'm showing the yellow area are the protected areas, and the kind of pinky purple areas are the industrial leases. You can see the kind of, the difficult balance where half of that landscape is zoned for industry and half of it is being declared of national significance as a national park, a national heritage site. By this stage, a lot of people are saying it should be a World Heritage Site. It's of incredible significance. So we've got this very difficult circumstance of industry and global heritage rock art living alongside each other, uncomfortably cohabiting that landscape. Since this time, a couple of those purple areas have been rolled back, thankfully, been given back to the national park and given back by industry so that they won't be developed. But there's still a very significant area of purple remaining for industrial development, very worrying, all of those sites. And one of those was taken up in 2015 by an expansion to the Yarra plant. So that was the fertilizer plant. And they decided they wanted to add to that and do what I think in many countries would not have been allowed, is to put a technical ammonium nitrate plant right next to it. So that's That's an explosives factory, in essence, next to a fertilizer factory. Yeah, an unusual decision. In places like America, they have to be a long way apart because they have been known to explode, do a lot of damage. This was completed in 2018, and it's just the latest of the industrial developments on Murujuga. And the combined efforts of all of these developments has caused concern both for ordinary people, but also amongst politicians. And in 2016, a Senate inquiry, so that's the highest level sort of inquiry that you can have other than a royal inquiry here in Australia, was set up to look into the issue of industrial pollution on the Burrup Peninsula or Murujuga. It took 2 years of proceedings to come up with its findings. And very interestingly, the final report, and this is quite unusual, split entirely along party political lines. So it was chaired by a Greens, there was a Greens chair, and then there were Labour and Liberals. So Labour is our left-leaning party, the Liberal Party is the more right-leaning party here in Australia. And all three parties presented their own recommendations. They couldn't agree on a common set of recommendations. The only statement that they collectively agreed on was that this is an incredibly important place. So the right-leaning parties made no recommendations whatsoever and made the statement again that there was no credible evidence of adverse impact of emissions on rock art. The Greens made extensive and very, very strong recommendations. They said this should go forward for World Heritage Site. They said that there should be no further industry developed on Murujuga under any circumstances, and that there should be very strict controls on the industry that was already there. And in particular, they said that the new Yarra plant should not be allowed to go forward and not be allowed to operate unless it operated with zero acid emissions. Labour also made strong recommendations. Again, they said it should go forward as a World Heritage Site. They called for a new and independent monitoring program to replace that flawed program before. And they stated that further industry should only be placed on Murujuga with very, very strict environmental conditions. There are a range of other important recommendations as well, and I'm just giving a summary here. Not least of the important recommendations from the Greens and Labour was that the Aboriginal corporation guides should be paid by the state and not have to rely on industry funding so that they could do their work. For 2 years, we waited to see what the Liberal government at the time would do about this, and which of the recommendations you would expect a set of recommendations like this, at least some of them to be implemented. When a final comment was made by the minister 2 years after the report was released in 2020, the government's official response was simply that the recommendations had been noted. There was no indication whatsoever that any of the recommendations would be implemented. Another piece of academic writing at the time, Jose Antonio Gonzalez Sarandona wrote a book detailing these industrial developments with a foreword by Michel Leblanche, who himself had been one of the first foreign archaeologists to work at Murujuga. Leblanche had worked there in the 70s, done some very important excavations, and helped to show, most people are concentrated on the rock art up till that time. Leblanche showed just how archaeologically significant that area was. What Sarandona brought to the debate was some very powerful language around landscape iconoclasm. So he believed that that development there was an intentional act to dishonor, or the industrialization of that landscape was an intentional act to dishonor an entire belief system and supersedes Western economic values above Indigenous living spiritual values. The scarred industrial landscape of Murujuga, bulldozed for decades by industry, intentionally stamps visual confirmation that there are victors and vanquished in this landscape. Very powerful statement there from Zarandona. With all this going on and increasing sort of frustration and anger at the ongoing industrial development of that landscape, the Western Australian government declared that it was going to move forward with the World Heritage nomination of Murujuga, which it has done very slowly. But this year, it submitted the nomination application. We're waiting to hear how that has been received by UNESCO. So after 50 or 60 odd years of development, we are left with this bizarre situation where the world's most important rock art site, in my view, the world's most important, just in terms of the size, the age of the site, the long sequence, sits in the middle of a massive industrial landscape. And that industry doesn't just, belch flames. It's not just the smell of industry, the noise of industry, the visual damage, that landscape iconoclasm, just the visual affront of that industrial building in this beautiful landscape. But those towers are also belching out large amounts of gases, and those gases are both toxic to human health, but also potentially very damaging to the rock art. One of the gases that is being emitted by those stacks is nitrogen oxide, which when it mixes with water forms nitric acid. So a very, very caustic acid, an acid that can eat away even the hardest surfaces. It can eat away at your roof, it can eat away at your car paint. Certainly it can eat away at rocks. Here, from the Copernicus satellite image, you can see for 1 week in January this year how the amount of nitrogen oxide being released in that landscape. You can see the Murujuga Peninsula underneath that map, and the areas there kind of in white at the top of the scale. They've gone off in back the measurable scale of NOx. They're at an extremely dangerous level. But as you can see, that nitric acid, there's the NO2 spreading right across the whole peninsula, even onto the islands. There's almost nowhere that is not receiving some of that pollution. And unfortunately, the winds swirl at Murujuga. So one day it'll be heading off to the south, the next day it'll be going up to the north. That whole area is subject to that very intense pollution. In terms of the actual numbers, so industry releases its own data about the emissions, and this is a plot of the industry emitted emissions for nitrogen oxides. The amounts you can see here. So in blue, we've got the Karratha gas plant. In purple there, you've got the liquid gas plant, and in orange you've got Yarra. So as you can see, Woodside is the lion's share of the nitrogen oxide emissions, and extremely high, up to 18,000 tons of nitric oxide a year. That's amongst the highest. So this makes it one of the most overall one of the most polluted landscapes in the southern hemisphere. And beyond that, 10 million tons per year of carbon dioxide, so a massive greenhouse gas emissions from this area as well. That's the second. This is the second highest. Woodside is the second highest CO2 emitter in the whole of Australia. So these are very, very serious levels. You'll see that after 2018, those are the years at the bottom there. There is an appearance that pollution has fallen a little, In fact, all that happened is that they changed the way that they were reporting the pollution. Woodside is on record as stating that they didn't change the technology in any way. There are no new cleaning technologies or anything put in place at that time. They simply changed the way they were calculating the emissions. And there have been a number of cases where it has been shown in the past that Woodside has underreported its emissions. But whether this is an underreporting or not, we're not in a position to judge. This is what is being admitted by the industries themselves, and even with the reduced reported emissions, you're still looking at 10,000 tons of NOx a year. That's vast. On top of that, there have been a bunch of major leaks that have been acknowledged. Yarra admitted to one extremely large leak, and that the evidence of which was found on the rocks as well. You could see the impact of that emission directly on the rock art when the testing was done. Beyond the nitrogen oxide, there's also large amounts of sulfur oxides being emitted by the ships and the industry as well. This is a very, very active port landscape now with all of that industrial activity, more than 1,900 ship movements a year. Every one of those burning fossil fuels and emitting sulfur dioxide. So those are both nitrogen oxide and sulfur oxide. So sulfur oxide goes up as a gas, and when it mixes with water, it creates sulfuric acid. Nitrogen oxide goes up as a gas and dust as well. And when that mixes with water, it creates nitric acid. Now, we know the effects of these substances. They've been known for a long time in the great European cities. Rome could talk, any archaeologist working in Rome for a long time about the effects of this kind of acidity and those kind of substances on stone. A lot of the great Roman sculptures have been eaten away by the acidic emissions around Rome. And this is now what we are experiencing at Murujuga, and what we are fearful of. So, with those kind of spectacular levels of pollution, what is this doing to these surfaces that we saw at the beginning? We know that these areas are being blanketed in nitric dust and are being blanketed in nitric oxide and sulfur oxides. What impact is this having on the rocks? Well, that was the question that John Black and I set ourselves in 2018. And we were simply unsatisfied with the results that have been coming from the government monitoring program. We felt that there was, being a government monitoring program, it's the same organization as monitoring that's giving all the go-aheads for industrial development. There needed to be a proper independent check on this. We needed a project which was not paid for by industry, which is not paid for by the government, where people can have confidence that the findings will be accurate and that the findings would genuinely speak to the science, and that whatever we found would be reported freely, fairly, and without bias. And so we decided to set up what we call the Murujuga Rock Art Conservation Project. And unusually, I suppose, for academic research, we decided to fund it entirely through donations from ordinary people. We started with crowdfunding. Within 1 month, we'd raised $86,000. Within 6 months, we'd raised nearly $300,000. We've now raised $360,000 for this project, all from private donations for people who are concerned about Murujuga and who want to see a truly independent study so that we can understand really what the impact of those emissions are on the rock art. The government also set up its own second project. So in terms of, you remember from the Commonwealth Senate inquiry, one of the recommendations is that there should be a new government program. We made a bunch of recommendations to the Western Australian government, and to their credit, they took up a lot of those and began their own rock art monitoring program. This monitoring program is, the money is coming from industry. So it's coming from that petrochemical industry from Woodside, Yarra, Rio Tinto, the industry that's there on Murujuga. And then that's funneled through the government. And that program has been ongoing since 2021. It's got excellent scientists on it. And I suppose what our project then is able to do is just to, rather as we would have liked to have done with the former project, just kind of keep it in check, make sure they're keeping honest, make sure that they're telling us what they're actually finding. And so having these two projects, I think, is enormously beneficial. We wish this project well, and we've done a lot to support it. We've given it advice. And we were instrumental, in fact, in advising in the setup. Now, to understand our findings, I'll explain why I'm not going to talk about the government project findings in a moment. And I want to talk about our findings. Ours is a publicly funded project. We are committed to transparency. Any data that we get will be shared openly, made available to anyone who wants it, so that it can be independently verified and independently checked. That is our commitment to the people that have funded us. In order to understand some of our findings, you need to understand a little bit about the rock. Okay, and this is where it gets a little bit boring, but we need to just have a look at this rock and see what's there. The rocks on Murujuga, there's two types. This is granophyre, but they're both quite similar. The parent rock in both cases is that blue color. So that kind of on the right there, this rock has been chipped. And the natural rock is that kind of blue with the white specks. There is then a kind of a weathering rind, so that if you were to cut that, you then get an area that is largely clays and is actually quite fragile. If you were to rub that, you see the kind of the orange area, if you were to rub that with your finger, quite a bit of that would come off. It's basically just loose clays. And then on top of that is the patina and the rock varnish. That's that kind of red-black. So when I showed you those pictures of that red landscape, what you were seeing was patina and rock varnish. That's very, very thin. In some places, literally as thin as 1 micron, but in other places it goes up. I've seen it as much as a centimeter in some places. But it's unusual to be thick. It's normally quite a thin surface. And the way that the rock art was made was that it was pecked through that patina, so that when these rock art images were made, they would have been very visible. So they pecked through the red color to expose the blue color underneath. These rock art images would have just shouted out at you. Today, a lot of them have repatinated. So I'll just show you, in case any of you weren't seeing the rock art image that's here, it's kind of a concentric circle shape. You can see I've stippled it in black there. So those are the actual lines, in this case, of a rock engraving. And in this case, it's completely patinated. So you can see the original color of the rock is kind of red, and that black is probably rock varnish. If I take the stipples away, you'll see that inside the line, it's maybe a little bit redder, a little bit less black. It hasn't quite gone back to the full color of the rock, but it very nearly has. And that's a very, very slow process. The image that we're looking at here is probably 30-odd, 40-odd thousand years old. It's very old. And it takes a long time for that, when you strike off a piece of that rock, for the color to grow again. Now, what happens? Why does it turn red? And why does it turn from that blue color to the red color? Well, that's an interesting one. So here you're seeing a couple of the samples that we've taken. And you can see the kind of the slice through it and how that rock changes. So you've got the gabbro there and the granophyre. The granophyre in this case is on the right, the gabbro on the left, which is a much more open structure. It's got far more holes, it's far more porous, but they're essentially similar in nature. That surface is largely, the colors that you're seeing are manganese and iron. And it is both an inorganic and organic process that has created that color on the surface. It doesn't just happen on its own. bacteria involved. And what they do basically is an incredibly hot landscape in the summer. Those surfaces can get up to 50 or 60 degrees centigrade. Almost nothing can live on that rock. But there are these very special bacteria, these budding bacteria, who sheathe themselves from the heat, who take sort of out of the natural dust that occur in that landscape, they take the iron, they take the manganese, and they shield themselves. And it's that process that creates the patina, this reddy black substance that you get on the surface. And that patina is made of about 70% clay, 25% manganese and iron, but it's the manganese and iron that's giving it the color. And that forms incredibly slowly at about 1 micron every 1,000 years. Hence, it takes 30,000 years to completely repatinate. The key thing that we need to remember for our purposes in this lecture is that that only happens, so that these budding bacteria remain dormant and can remain dormant for centuries. They only activate under alkaline conditions, so above 7. They can only live, proliferate, and create these sheaths when the rock is above 7, also in a moist environment. So as soon as you have a pH on that surface that falls below 7, you will have no patina formation, and in fact, exactly the opposite. So our project has been, we are committed to doing no new damage to Murujuga. We've taken rock samples, but all from top right here is an old quarry. There's a number of old quarries that we used when they made the roads and the port. And those are areas where the landscape is already damaged, but there's a lot of shattered rock around there. And the same around the roads. There are a lot of shattered rock around the roads. So we've used those places where the landscape is already damaged, where the landscape has already been culturally cleared. So there's no cultural values. Those are the places where we've collected our samples, and we've been taking those back to the lab to analyze. We've also been doing our own tests in the landscape as well, doing things like pH testing. And back in the lab, we then, Ron Watkins, our geochemist, and his team here in Perth, take off that outer layer. You can see here how it's sliced at the top left, ground into a powder. So the patina is made into a powder, placed in a tube, and then we subject it, or they subject it, to a whole range of acids, so that we choose the natural acids that are out there in Murujuga. So nitric acid, sulfuric acid, and a whole range of in different concentrations, and look at what the results are. We can then test how much of that powder is dissolved by the acids. Also, we have another member of our team is based, Thorsten Geisler and his student, Jolan Newman, are based at the University of Bonn in Germany. And they've also been doing tests, but not on powdered rock, but on unpowdered rock, just to see if that responds any differently. So just placing blocks of rock into a climate weather chamber. So what you're seeing here is a kind of an artificial weather chamber where you've got rainwater that we can adjust to the actual acidity of Murujuga rainwater. And you've also got things like lights so we can simulate the heat of Murujuga. And so basically what you can do in a chamber like this is speed up time, kind of simulated speed up time. So you subject it to 10 years worth of rainwater, 10 years worth of heat, and look at the result. How is that rock responding to 10 years of Murujuga climate? And a range of different tools. This is the PXRF, a number of different readers then can examine those samples and see how they've degraded and in what ways, which chemicals have come off and in what amount. We've been busy publishing those results over the last few years. It takes a couple of years to get a major project like this through to publication. And last year we had 3 major publications came out. And what these basically showed is the mechanism by which the pollution is going up into the air, coming down onto the rocks. So this is a graphic that I did together with CNN International, where you're seeing nitrogen oxide and sulfur oxide going up into the air. Once it's in the air, it then mixes with rain. Rain is pretty rare in this landscape. This is a very, very dry landscape. So some of the water comes down in light rain, forms very strong acidity, but most of the nitrogen oxide at least comes down as dust. And then on the ground, so that the rocks are covered in this acidic dust. And then when you get dew, so in winter, this landscape has quite heavy dews, that dust will then dissolve and become nitric acid. And any additional rain will then mix with that dust and liquefy the dust. So that's what creates the acid, and creates the acidity that we've been simulating in the laboratories. And the key finding from 2 years of laboratory work is that it doesn't matter which acids we subject those samples to. We did an entire range of different acids and at different strengths, but the same result pretty much comes out in every single case. On the left here, you have gabbro, and on the right, you have granophyre. And you can see there's a slight difference between the two rocks. Perhaps not surprisingly, because remember I said that gabbro is a much looser and more open structure. So because it's more open, so it's not as hard, basically, it's likely to break down quicker, and that is what we find. What I want you to notice here is that tipping point. So between acidities of 12 and 6, we're seeing nothing basically come off the rocks. So those rock powders remain completely intact. No elements come off when you subject those rocks to acids that are above 6. So anything alkaline, there is no degradation of that surface. However, as soon as you subject those rocks to acids that are lower than 6, so acidic substances, you can see that you're starting to get parts per million extracted. So that line starts to turn upwards. And it actually turns up pretty strongly in both cases. And the tipping point in both cases, I'm sure as you can see, is about 6.5. So basically what we're showing through this diagram is that as soon as those rock surfaces hit a pH of less than 6.5, they start to degrade. And that what is lost, in this case, we're just showing the manganese coming off. We've done the same, and we'll be publishing this shortly. We've looked at everything else as well. Iron comes off a little bit later, but manganese, which is one of the main chemicals in that surface substance in the patina, starts to come off at 6.5 and comes off very strongly. By the time you get down to acid levels of 4 or 3, you can see there's significant amounts coming off there, 250 parts per million. That's highly significant. Now, so what are the pHs of the surfaces at Murujuga? Are they down to those levels, or do they all sit above 6.5 in the kind of the happy space? Even above 7 is the really happy space. That's when the patina can grow. Well, one of the first things we did with our project actually was to employ the famous Ian McLeod, a conservator by training. Now, Ian had measured way back in 2003 and 2004 a bunch of rocks and looked at the pH levels on those rocks. And he also looked at a number of rocks that were collected very early in the 1960s by the museum. And so before any industrial emissions, before any pollution had started to be really emitted in Murujuga, so that we have a kind of a control. We know that the rocks were sitting at a pH of about 6.8, plus or minus a bit. They were, that's the kind of level. We think they're probably a bit higher than that. I would think probably Robert Bednarik is probably right. Robert Bednarik said they were probably sitting between 7.2 and 7.4 pre-industry. But these ones that were collected early in the industrialization process we're sitting at 6.8, so we have a control. Where did he find the pH was sitting in 2003, 2004? Very low. So he found that those, at his 30 samples, they all ranged from 4.25, a pH of 4.25, to a pH of 5.74. This is in 2003 and 2004, the height of the construction work actually on that liquid gas. So it was already acidic at that time, and we know that pollution levels have increased dramatically since then. And at that time, he said, sure as night follows day, that rock art will decay. 14 years on, we paid for Ian to go back in 2017 to retest those same rocks, and he did that for us. He found that those surfaces were still highly acidic, and indeed in the results that he presented to us, they were slightly more acidic even than in 2003 to 2004. In that case, the lowest mean, so this is when you average out a number of readings, was 3.81. That's incredibly low. And the lowest value he recorded, so this is the most acid that has ever been recorded on Murujuga, was 2.98. Astonishing. Since then, Ian McLeod has been, like many people who work up at Murujuga, you suddenly find yourself employed as a consultant for the petrochemical industry. And Ian's figures have changed a little bit since he became a consultant for the petrochemical industry. And his recent publication shows pH figures that are not as bad as that. But nonetheless, these figures are still acidic. You know, look at the readings for 2019, for example. They are all, the highest is only at 5.2. All of the rest of them are down in the 4s. Even if we're generous and take the cyclone year, 2018, those figures are not that much better. What is very clear in these readings is that the pHs go up and down a bit. You get a cyclone come through, it washes those rocks clean, and they return for a very short period to their original pH of high 6s, low 7s. But within a few months, the acidity in that landscape, the amount of industrial emissions are so high that those rocks are starting to plummet. You're starting to get pH going down into the 4s again. Remember what I showed you before with where those rocks start to degrade. Now in red here, I have circled those recent readings of Ian McLeod. So that is where the rocks are actually currently sitting, even according to his figures that were produced in the context of employment for the petrochemical industry, for Yarra actually. But still they're showing, just that's from his readings, not from our own, that these rocks are in a place where they are on any normal day, they are degrading, and the manganese is loosening and it's coming off as dust. So this is categorical proof that the pollution at Murujuga is damaging the rock art. Acid rain plus nitrogen has its own problem. So in a very nitrogen poor environment like Murujuga, when large amounts of nitrogen suddenly hit the landscape, and remember, we've also got a fertilizer plant there, letting off fertilizer dust. We're also very concerned as to what might happen organically on those surfaces. So I've simply talked chemically. What are the effects of the pollution, the chemical pollutants? But if we're suddenly a large amount of nitrogen hits those surfaces with water and fertilizer, we could see an explosion of microorganisms, of microbacteria and lichens and mosses, those kinds of things. And any microorganism is itself an acid releaser. So those surfaces are pretty, they get up to 50, 60 degrees centigrade in the summer. So by and large, there's very little in the way of lichens and things on those surfaces. But what will happen as those rocks start to, for the first time in 45, 50,000 years receive large amounts of nitrogen. That landscape received large amounts of nitrogen. We're not sure. Certainly the grass will grow much higher, increasing the fire risk. And fire is obviously a major potential cause of damage to these rocks. But the next phase of our research is going to be looking at what will happen organically. What are the organic acids that could be produced on those surfaces? We can see already from the chemistry that these rocks are in trouble. We're concerned also that they might be in trouble from the living creatures that will proliferate on these rocks, probably for the first time. So things that have never existed on these rocks before will suddenly be able to live there and will immediately outcompete those budding bacteria. I mean, those budding bacteria really struggle for a living. They're the only things that can survive there, and they survive there by making this patina over the top of them. Those things will get outcompeted very quickly with a lot of nitrogen in that environment, and they might even go extinct on this landscape. So those are the things that we're looking at now. You know, what is the future of these surfaces? You can see a surface like this is starting to break down, and so this raised for us a number of questions. Is the degradation we're seeing on a beautiful turtle image like this caused by the pollution? And I said to John, I said, I think we can test for this, because there are a bunch of collections in Australia that show where people have, like, for example, Robert Bednaric's old collection, but also Michel Leblanchet's collection, where they went around quite a large area, taking lots of photographs of rock art. Sylvia Hallam's collection. And then Bednaric working in the 60s, Patricia Vinicum in the 80s, Hallam in the 70s, Enzo Virilli in the 70s. We've got all these fantastic collections that are there that we're not really using. And I said, what we're going to do is we're going to make use of the incredible new facility at the University of Western Australia that I set up a few years ago, the Digitisation Centre of Western Australia. And we'll digitise all those early slides, all the ones that where people are willing to share with us, of Murujuga rock art. And we can then start to compare these early images taken sort of pre or early in the industrialization with images taken today, so that not only can we have the chemical tests to show, we know chemically those rocks are degrading, but we can then have the visual test to say that we can actually see it happening. So based on all of the digital data, digitized records, I could see that there were about 100 sites that had a long history of recording, where we had pictures of those sites from the 70s, 80s, 90s, and 2000s. Some of those were culturally sensitive, or in places, in remote places where it's simply not practical to return. But from those, we selected the best 26. So the 26 where we had the best coverage in areas that were both close to industry and as far from industry as we could get on Murujuga. So we took a sample, and you can see the sample here, so that the ones sort of at the far left are broadly away from the biggest spread of nitrogen oxide and sulfur oxide, and the ones kind of top right here are right within that massive nitrogen oxide halo, and near the ammonia plants as well. So we attempted to take the biggest spread we could and see if we could see differences. So each one of those little dots there, the red dots are granophyre, and the green dots are gabbro. And to see what's happening at those sites. And so at each one of these, as I say, we had this span of images from the ideally 1960s, but some of them only 1970s, all the way through. And then I went back and re-photographed all of them. And indeed, we see some quite dramatic changes at some of the sites. This is an image of a fish. The colors that you're seeing here, we need to broadly, in this case, ignore the color difference that you see in these two images. On the left, it's a Sylvia Hallam photograph, and this was taken on a slide that was very blue. There's no doubt that slide is degraded. But the more important thing here is all of the new flakes that have appeared on this surface. So when she took that image in 1974, there were only really one major flake on that rock, which is kind of, I don't know if you're going to be able to see my arrow. Can you see that arrow? Matthew, can you see me moving the arrow? No. You can. So, there's an image. So in 1974, you can see that kind of recent flake. You can actually see it's repatinated a bit by 2021. But all of these little flakes that I've marked here in red so that you can see them, these are all new. None of these flakes were showing. None of those flakes were present in 1974. It looks like the rock has grown. it hasn't. The top of the rock in 1974 was in shadow. That's why it's kind of a different shape. And the image is clearer, I think, because the contrast was whacked up in the slide. I don't think the rock art has faded much. I think that's part of this was also digitized quite early and not by us, not to the highest quality. But of great concern here is the amount of degradation of that fish image. Now, we've looked in, so the location where this is found is right on the salt haulage road. And it's almost certain that this degradation is not, in fact, a result of the acidic pollution, but is of salt dust falling on that rock and causing that degradation. And the good news there is that in 2003, salt stopped being hauled by motor vehicle when it was kind of blowing all over the place and was put on a conveyor belt. And the salt today doesn't blow. So this kind of damage is probably very short-term damage that was done between 1974, when the salt was already just beginning to be operated, up until about 2003. And since that time, there's been no new damage on this particular rock, but it shows that the damage that can occur from the industrial exploitation of that landscape. But rocks nearer to the Woodside plant, we can see a number of things happening, but most disturbingly, we can start to see the breakdown of some of the rocks, and I've highlighted it here in the red surface, where you can start to see little chips, little spalls coming off, exactly as we would predict from the laboratory findings, where the manganese and iron is starting to detach from that rock and come off. And of course, what it'll leave is a much paler surface underneath. But if that patina comes off, there will simply be no rock art left, because the rock art doesn't go into the parent rock below. It only went down as far as the parent rock. The rock art is all situated in that patina. And so if we lose the patina, we lose the rock art. What our scientific experiments show is that we will expect to see a number of the images fading in color, so lightening in color, so that as the darker manganese and the iron, the red iron comes off, the surfaces are going to go more yellow. And at 9 out of the 26 sites that we have used, we can see what we believe is evidence of this lightening. In one case, it's absolutely diagnostic, but you can see here how the evidence is clear cut. We from an image that was only taken in 1988 by Patricia Vinnicum to an image born digital 2021 taken by me on the right, you can see the degree to which that rock is starting to lighten. And when you start to then look at the whole span of images from the 1960s, through to now 2023, you can see this progressive fading. So going from quite a dark surface to what is becoming an increasingly light red and orange surface, a very worrying trend. So I would say that the photographic image wouldn't be diagnostic in itself, but in the context of the scientific findings, it further confirms what we already know from the laboratory science. And what we get from the photographic recording is more evidence of the kind of, just placing industry in that landscape is violence in itself, but you start to see the disregard for those surfaces, people scrawling their names on them, scratching on them, smashing at rocks. That's you see the other damage, the evidence of the people in that landscape who don't have the traditional respect for that landscape, and who leave their own marks and damage on the rock art and archaeology. Even from more photographic evidence, this is from Woodside's own visitor centre. They have a very interesting, so there's a little visitor centre there where you can learn about the industrial process. And they have a roof where water drips down between the building and this structure that you see in the photograph. So there's kind of a line where water drips on the concrete pavement, on these paving slabs. And where that water drips, and this has only been there for sort of not that long, a decade or so, a couple of decades, you can already see how the paving is being etched by the acidity of the rain. So within Woodside's own plant, direct evidence of the damage that their emissions are doing. I'm sure this will get, after this talk, I would expect that paving to be replaced instantly, but it's very strong evidence and further confirming evidence of the alarming data that I have shown you from the scientific evidence. So this is a landscape that is desecrated visually and is being increasingly desecrated chemically. Is that the end of the story? What can we do? What should we do? Unfortunately, the story continues. There are still 2 new developments that are currently being permitted, some of which have already received permits. One is yet another fertilizer plant, even though we know that other fertilizer plant has added in a demonstrable way to the pollution in that landscape. This is one of the few places in the world where pollution levels are rising, CO2 emissions are rising, when the rest of the world is drastically cutting. New polluting industries are being allowed. Where this site, some rock art sites will be directly impacted by the placement of this. It's a very, very controversial new plan development, and all sorts of environmental organizations have tried to put legal blocks in place of this development, but nonetheless, it's still going ahead, and they've even got grants from the government to subsidize the construction of the plant, unbelievably. Also in plan, the second one is yet another expansion of Woodside, this to double the capacity of the liquid natural gas plant. So to drill yet more gas wells offshore and double the processing capacity for liquid natural gas. So this is a landscape that, without severe intervention, is likely to see not only the current pollution levels sustained, but probably, and unusually for the world, significantly increased if these expansions go ahead. What is the government monitoring program saying about all of this? Well, unfortunately, nothing. As you saw at the beginning of my presentation, the leader of that project saying that there is no evidence still, no peer-reviewed evidence or only anecdotal evidence that acidity is damaging the rock art. In spite of all the work that Robert Bednarik did in the 2000s, all the work that we've been doing, we're still hearing the same line for a government program. Now, why? Why do we still hear this in 2023? With all the evidence that has piled up, certainly it might be in the government's interest to deny that industry is damaging rock art in this area. It's certainly in industry's interest to deny that it's damaging the rock art, but the evidence is showing otherwise. The evidence is showing that we need action. What kind of science is coming out of this project? Well, it should be very good science. They've got great scientists working on it. I have every confidence in the method that they are employing. The data that they collect should be sound. The people that are working on it are good people. but they're not saying anything. We are speaking out against those two developments that I just presented to you, saying that the evidence states that no more polluting industry should be allowed at Murujuga. Indeed, even the existing industry needs to be regulated more firmly. We need to get those acidic pollutions significantly down. Why is the government program remaining silent? Well, one has to wonder, you know, those are two massive industrial developments. If we wait till this program completes, so it's a $27 million program due to complete in 2026. By the time they've completed and reported, both those two new developments will be approved and functioning. One just wonders about the timing. Any independent scientific research is going to find the same things that we find. And I would have thought that they are already finding this. They've done enough research already, but I suspect they already know that acidity is and does eat away at those rocks. They had a large symposium earlier this year, but it was behind closed doors. No outside observers were allowed in. I had a proxy. I was allowed to attend as a proxy, but I was told to leave the symposium. I was not allowed in to the government monitoring program symposium. There were no news reporters in there. No one was allowed to know what findings they're getting. Why the secrecy? Our project is that every part of our data is available pre-publication if necessary. We're willing to share anything at any time. It is so important that we have the data, that we know what is being found. This government program cannot continue to keep silent while major developments are continuing. And at least the news reporters are recognizing this. And starting, this is a news report from just a few days ago, the 13th of April, noting that the tensions are rising between scientists over the industrial impact on Murujuga's sacred rock art. Well, indeed, they are rising. I'm really alarmed. There's kind of a war of words breaking out, with our research showing clearly that industrial impacts are damaging the rock art. And the government monitoring program saying that there is no evidence. It's simply mischievous, and it's not helpful at a time where we need decisive action. Decisive action is happening on the streets. There are protests almost daily outside Woodside head office, and many climate organizations are taking Woodside to task for the line that they are taking on on their emissions. Even within Woodside, you know, their own shareholders, have been reported in the news, 49% of Woodside shareholders at the last annual general meeting voted against their climate change and emissions strategy. You know, so even within Woodside's own shareholders, there's a great worry about the line they're taking. And there are protests both in Perth, that was outside Woodside headquarters, protests up in Murujuga itself, a whole bunch of traditional owners from the area have spoken out, sort of in spite of the agreement in 2002. They said they're not willing to remain silent anymore, and they're speaking out against these new developments and against the damage that is happening to their cultural landscape. One of the groups is called Save Our Songlines. They're doing a remarkable work to raise raise awareness about saving Murujuga. Climate change activism is very a daily report in the Western Australian news, on TV and the radio, even in some ways becoming more extreme. Here, this is an artwork in the West Australian Gallery, the Art Gallery of WA, where someone spray painted the Woodside logo over a very famous art piece. Fortunately, that art piece was covered in perspex, so the artwork wasn't damaged itself. But I think that it shows the level of frustration that the public has reached, that action is not being taken to deal with something that both scientists and ordinary folk feel very, very strongly about. Earlier this year, the road, people set up a protest across the road to stop. They closed down, in fact, that industry for a whole day by closing the road, raising awareness of the gas and the disrespect for culture. Well, what's the road? I mean, there's obviously a role, for these kind of protests. These are not the kind of things usually that scientists get involved in, but I have great respect for it. What's the role of a scientist in these kind of matters? Well, I think the role of the scientist is to speak truth to power and to get those truths out, to do true independent laboratory research and to report that, to make all of our findings accessible to anyone who's interested. Anyone can have our findings and test them, check them up, verify them, do whatever statistical work they want to do on them. We report our work regularly to our many funders who've been so generous, digging into their pockets and funding us to the tune of 360,000. It's astonishing that ordinary folk have given such support. What's the role of Woodside and those big corporates? That's more difficult. Woodside last year recorded a profit of $6.5 billion. It's very clear, so that the industry that operates at Murujuga has not had new cleaning technology installed since the early 2000s. It's now aging, it's archaic, it's emitting far, the pollution levels are much higher than they need to be. I believe that the only way that rock art and industry can live happily side by side is if those pollution levels are reduced drastically. It can be done. Even a small percentage of that annual profit invested into cleaning technology could in fact take us to the point where pollution levels drop to the point where they are not damaging the rock art. This is a moment, with climate change being what it is, and the onus on every corporation to play its role. There's lots of greenwashing around. Corporations telling us, some corporations telling us how much they're trying to do, but not actually doing very much. But when you look beyond that, there's a lot of governments and corporations that are actually doing a heck of a lot. There are countries that are radically reducing their carbon dioxide emissions, for example, and companies that are radically divesting of anything that involves the production of carbon dioxide. So for those companies that are still in the business and that are still making large profits, like Woodside, invest some of that profit into what will be, the sustainability of your organization. Looking after the rock art, I think, is also about looking after the business. If that corporation can behave responsibly in that landscape, it bodes well, not just for Murujuga, but far beyond Murujuga. Woodside and the rock art can live potentially side by side, but it requires investment. I don't see why the taxpayer would always be the one that pays for the cleanup. The corporations have a responsibility as well. Our team would be more than happy to work with Woodside and others to advise on cleaning technology. One of the great ironies of this landscape is that one of the corporations there, Yara, which is operating the fertilizer plant, that corporation makes most of its money making cleaning technology for stacks. So that Yara is the largest producer of pollution scrubbers for industrial stacks in the world. If Yara used its own best technology, it could reduce its pollution levels almost to zero. And if they sold that technology to Woodside, it would vastly reduce the problem that we face at Murujuga. I've gone to the very beginning. We will take a brief review as I head through. So at the end of this talk, it's a not very positive message that we have industrial pollution levels higher than they have ever been in the history of that landscape. Clear scientific evidence that those pollution levels are damaging the rock art. A lot of landscape at Murujuga already irretrievably damaged? And that is a big question. What does one do with this industry? Most of that industry was only intended to be there for 30, 40, 50, 100 years at the absolute maximum. That should all be removed at some point, and that landscape restored as best as possible to its indigenous original landscape. And I think that that's where we go next. We should be planning for the restoration of that landscape, for the removal of that industry. If we need to upgrade the woodside plant massively, to get, because this is aging technology, maybe this is the time to move that plant. Maybe it's time to move it to where it should have been, somewhere away from Murujuga, and restore that landscape. Turn it back to the beautiful landscape that it once was, a landscape in which whales breed, dugong, play in the mangrove swamps, a landscape of incredible natural, but more importantly, cultural beauty. This is a landscape that largely could be restored. It would cost a lot, but it's kind of, is our generation up for it? Can we undo the mistakes of last century? Can our generation be the generation that undoes the mistakes of the past and takes a place like Murujuga, proclaims it as World Heritage, and then restores it to its true World Heritage, how it was before we damaged it? That's the challenge for us. That's the exciting thing. Images like this are the things that can inspire us, I think, to behave better in that landscape. Thank you for your time. Thank you for listening to this talk. And please help us to protect Murujuga rock art from destruction by industry. Thank you.
Thanks to you, Benjamin. It was a very interesting presentation, also sad, but reality is reality, so we cannot cover it with bubbles and sprinkles. That's what it is. If you want, you can unshare your screen, so we can be both on the screen for a small. So we have Jeanette Gagnon. Jeanette Gagnon, I don't know if you know her. Thank you very much for this very interesting information. So we thank you, Jeanette, for listening this very important talk from Benjamin Smith. Actually, I have a curiosity. How did you end up with this topic? Was it immediately after that you arrived to Australia? Was there, maybe you felt that there was a void around this kind of approach to rock?
Yeah, I became interested in it because it's actually through Patricia Binnican. So when 2 years before Patricia Binnican died, she started to come back to South Africa each year, and I was still in South Africa at that time. And she realized that she had a lot of old material that she hadn't worked on since the 1960s. And she was funded to come back and work on her old South African materials. So every year we'd see her, and every year she would tell us these horror stories about Murujuga and how it's just unbelievable that more industry could be allowed and that the existing industry could continue to expand. And why couldn't it just go somewhere else? There were so many other better places for it. And then she died. And when I came to Australia, I was fascinated to go up to that landscape. I got the opportunity through a colleague here, Joe McDonald, took me up on a field school, and she then introduced me to John Black, who I've talked about, who was extremely concerned and who was working then on this issue of critiquing the colour change project by the former government program. And we got thinking that now is the time to start a truly independent project. And so John and I put together the vision that we have, and that's what led us up to today. It's work that not everyone would do. It can be you're not everyone's best friend when you're speaking out against multi-million-dollar industry. We feel that we're all decent. We're willing to speak truth to power. We're not going to embellish the facts. We're going to tell them as we see it, and we hope that industry responds in the same generous way.
Of course. Well, that's a very important research, and also the political impact is very, very clear. In fact, the other question was, how is the reception of this kind of, how do you feel your role in society? Because what one should think is that a respected professor would have only a nice welcome in society. Is it sometimes not quite so because of this approach?
Yes, well, I mean, I worked in Nelson Mandela's South Africa, so I am fully aware of the politics of archaeology. In South Africa, our role was to create a public archaeology where none existed before, because none was possible under the apartheid era. Where the the magnitude of African achievement prior colonization was formally denied by the state government. So I'm used to dealing with the politics of archaeology. I'm not sure I hadn't prepared myself for the politics of archaeology in Australia. As an outsider coming in, it's obviously awkward for an outsider to take up quite such a controversial topic. But I was standing in big footsteps. Bednarik had been here before. I know that Bednarik received death threats for his work on Murujuga. I haven't received death threats yet, but I've certainly received very strong Australian call. When someone screams at you in flowery language, they call it a spray. I've received quite a lot of sprays from my work at Murujuga. All one can do is say that I'm doing what I think is right. I believe that I am working with integrity. I'm helping to support independent science to understand an issue that is of great national importance and national significance. That this is, we need to know the evidence. And over the past 20 odd years, we've come to be a little cautious of what we're being told, both by industry and by the government programs. I think the current government program is very different, but I am concerned that they are not speaking out, and I look forward to them speaking out soon and starting to get their results.
Of course. In fact, this is a big difference from Europe, because so actually me and you and Benjamin, we first met in Canada, where I moved in 2009, and one of the things that astonished me moving there was the fact that archaeology was still something, let's say, alive, that still had an impact on local society, which was not the case in Europe. I mean, there is a political aspect, but there are not living communities. When you go to Val Camonica, there is no living community attached to the symbolical value. There is a cultural community attached to the importance, to the cultural value of the art, but this is different. So actually, I think you have a very first-hand experience of this kind of change, because you approached archaeology in Europe, in Africa, and in Australia. So how is the difference, for example, between between Europe and the other two? Probably this is the main difference, because in Europe it's sort of past populations that are not alive anymore, while in Africa and in Australia is still living population who, of course, change their mind, their mythology, their belief, their symbolics in some respect. So how is the difference between Africa and Australia? Maybe, I don't know, I just say, in Africa, broadly speaking, there are less, for example, about your topic, there are less industry. And so there is maybe not a lot of care, maybe, about the rock art. But
in Africa, there is a lot of industry. Yeah. In Africa, there is a lot of industry. But I don't believe that what has happened at Murujuga could happen in any African country. There is no site in Africa that has been subject to that kind of destruction. Even though, people would think, well, how is, countries that have very weak heritage laws, nonetheless, they have protected their heritage better than that. One has to say that it was a mistake. It wasn't mischievous in the Australian context, sort of building that industry on Murujuga. It was that mistake. The iron export went to the place that it thought would have the least impact. It was only once the iron ore export facility had been built that people realized, oh my God, we've made a terrible mistake. This is an incredibly rich cultural landscape. But nonetheless, one would have thought that after a mistake like that you just decide, okay, the iron ore can continue going through there, but there are other places. So another port was built further along, Port Hedland, and a lot of iron goes out through there. You slowly phase out then Murujuga, and you slowly redirect, these exports, and even the gas pipe coming in, you redirect somewhere else. But it didn't happen. There's been this constant pressure. It's almost as if we made a mistake, but we're not going to admit it. And the best way to not admit it is by keep shoving industry there. And the more you shove there, the worse it gets, the more controversial it gets, the more politically fraught it gets. I just reminded you the difference between Europe and Australia. It's always said, I don't know if it's true, but that Europe is the only country where a government has been rolled on the basis of rock art conservation. So that at Foz, the Portuguese government lost the election because they were proposing to damage a rock art site in Portugal. So yes. a government party.
I was also going to quote that case because it's one of the cases we got in Europe. Also, we have Mila de Abreu, that is, of course, part of the Centro Camuno. She was one of the main supporters of the keeping of the forest, keeping the rock art, and they won. That was a good thing.
So here in Australia, I think the politicians are also feeling the pressure. Whether we'll see a government change because of rock art in Australia, I don't know. But one of the things that is happening here, so one of the really important things here, is that we're going to have a vote this year on whether Aboriginal people are permitted a voice to Parliament. So another kind of chamber, an Aboriginal chamber, that can act as an advisory body to the Australian Parliament. That's a very, very important move forward. And an Aboriginal voice to Parliament is obviously something that I fully support, but an Aboriginal voice to Parliament is exactly the kind of thing we need to deal with things like Murujuga. The government needs to hear more clearly from its own communities what is happening on the land and how developments like have happened at Murujuga are impacting on cultural lands and on Aboriginal country. A voice to Parliament could be a very important mechanism for dealing with issues like this. But popular pressure is important as well. Talks like this are important. If 10,000 people watch this talk and it affects their vote at the next election, that is significant. Politicians are concerned about these things. And I think that's no doubt why the current Labour government has put in place such a robust and strong monitoring program. But let that government also put pressure on that monitoring program to report when we need it to report, and not to wait 6 years before they tell us what they found.
Yes, of course. What I felt when during your presentation, I had the feeling that you needed. You presented such a great number of studies, very, very scientific. What I felt is that these companies, these bigger companies, they are so blind that you really need to go and look for any number that can demonstrate something. What I want to say is that a presentation like yours for let's say a similar rock art in Europe, probably would have lasted us because I think that the sensibility would have been like stronger. The feeling that I had, it's really the need to go and look for all the small details. And this, I'm saying this because I'm sure it reflects a different kind of situation.
You're right.
A different
You're right.
strength.
It's so obvious. I shouldn't need to speak for 2 hours about it. It's that obvious.
Yes.
But just this week, I've faced a government program once again telling us that there is no scientific evidence that the rock art is by pollution. It's unbelievable. It's unconscionable. It's crazy. You know, after all of this story, so we need to tell this story time and time again, and it's crucial that people, you know, pull that apart. What is the agenda? Why would you possibly say that after all these years? What is the agenda there? The agenda is worrying. The science is not. Let's have good science. Let's respect each other. Let's get the evidence out there, and that evidence is clear. Cut the pollution levels and cut them now.
I think that with these words, we can conclude with this interesting presentation. So we thank Benjamin Smith for taking the time, also taking his a part of his night, because I believe it's 11 o'clock at night at this moment. So that's very kind, because we had to adjust for the, of course, for the time difference of time in Italy and Australia, Western Australia. So a big thank you. A big thank you for those of you who follow the presentation. Also those that will follow it in the next months and years on Facebook or YouTube. Something more you want to add?
No, thank you very much indeed.
Very well. Okay, so thank you guys, and see you at the next presentation.